Welcome everybody to IPPS Southern Region's very first micro meeting. Today we're pleased to host Dr. Jeb Fields, and his talk is on the science of substrates, foundational science for applied solutions. And it's one of my favorite topics. So I'm excited to hear what he has to share today. And we're glad to have all of you along for the ride. So welcome and take it away, Jeb.
All right. Well, thank you, Cheryl. I wanted to start off and just tell everyone a little bit about myself in case anyone doesn't know me. I'm an extension or assistant professor and extension specialist in commercial ornamental horticulture at the LSU AgCenter. My primary focus on the nursery production and landscape horticulture. So it's a nice little blend right there of ornamental production. I'm also the director of the Hammond Trial Gardens and the Louisiana Super Plant Program, and currently am serving as the assistant director of the Hammond Research Station. And while that's all my global job, my favorite part is my substrate research program. I think at heart, I am a substrate scientist. I'm very interested in engineering different substrates, different medias, especially with regards to water and hydraulics. So kind of the way, just a bit of info of how this got started off. Last summer, I sent an email to Jeremy Piggins, who was hosting the Mobile conference, and said, I'd like to talk so I can come because it's easier for me to justify coming to an IPPS conference by video talk. And they said that I was about 6 months late. They had everything booked, but we had an idea of doing a micro meeting to kind of as a pre-conference primer, which I thought was a cool idea. And we scheduled that for September 7th. And unfortunately, I got hammered by Hurricane Ida just a few days before that. And I just a little bit out going off topic. I grew up in Florida. I've been in North Carolina and Virginia Beach for a lot of my years, and now in Louisiana. I've been through 10 or 15 big hurricanes, and this one was one of the worst I had experienced. My whole property and house and our station flooded. We lost about 150 huge century-old trees at the research station. I didn't have power for a month, so I just luckily got enough juice on my phone to be able to send Bree and Cheryl a text or an email and said, hey, I'm not going to make this meeting. But so I do apologize for the delay, but we are here now. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to kind of pick things back up and give this talk. So this is going to be a little bit on substrate science, as it said, the basics and foundational science and how we use that to come up with some real world solutions or solve some problems. And my old advisor for my PhD, Jim Owen, used to always start off with this Rorschach test, which I really liked. And he'd ask all the growers in the audience or whoever was talking to what you see when you see this. And oftentimes we'd hear bark particles or substrate particles or some peat or maybe sand or whatever it might be. But as a substrate scientist, I see in between the particles. I see the void spaces and the pores, and that's where really all the action is happening. And that's what I'm really excited about. So a substrate, just like any soil or matrix, has three phases: a solid, water, and air. And this is really how we characterize substrates for the longest time. We look at our porosity, our water container capacity, our airspace, and our solids. And the solids really don't change, although they actually do, but that's for a talk some other time. Over time, we're going to consider them pretty static. But we measure water and air at the maximum water holding capacity, which is a state that we really don't ever achieve in production. So instead, the porosity is really continually changing with the air and airspace and moisture. Obviously, as we irrigate, we fill up these pores. As the plant uses water, evaporation, drainage, these pores are drained. And this flux is a daily flux. And so that's really where I like to live, on these changing hydraulics. And so what I like to think about more as a substrate scientist and a substrate physicist is the pores themselves. And so I really like this graphic out of an old textbook that shows the different types of water, or really the different categories of pores. So first you have what is called hygroscopic water or hygroscopic pores. And this is just water that is bound to the surface of a particle. When you hear people talk about unavailable water, we're talking about hygroscopic water. It's bound too tight to a particle that a plant can't absorb it. Conversely, on the other end, we have air or gravitational pores. And these are pores that if I were to prevent drainage and fill up a substrate or a soil or anything, a matrix, they would be full with water. But the minute I allow free drainage, I take my hand off the holes on the bottom and let it drain, the water that drains out is the gravitational water, and this is the gravitational pores. And so obviously that's not available for plant use either because it's not there in production. So the central one, capillary water, is really where we live in, and that's where all the plant water that is used in production is from. And this capillary water is water held between two particles, and that's at different tensions. So to kind of assess these types of water and the shifting, changing water throughout production, we look at hydraulic properties. There's three primary hydraulic properties we talk about, and that is water content, water potential, and hydraulic conductivity. Water content is straightforward. It's how much water is in a media, a substrate, a soil, what have you. Water potential is how tightly the water is held to the particles or in the substrate matrix. And then hydraulic conductivity is really how easily water moves through the soil. So they're all three connected. If I change water content, then my hydraulic conductivity and my water potential change. Anything I change, they all change. So that's really a basic. Today, we're going to talk about just these two properties and what we can do with them: water content and water potential. So we all know water content. Like I said, it's the most basic, how much we have. I think if you were to go out to your pine bark pile right now, your moisture content would probably be somewhere at 60 to 65%. And this is a gravimetric means. And so I want to kind of hammer this home. We measure water content in practice and theory on gravimetric, which is weight. If I have a bucket of substrate and how much water, and there's 60% moisture content by weight, that means 60% of the weight in that container is water. As a substrate scientist, however, I prefer to look at things on a volume basis because we can really make comparisons across different substrates. So for instance, if I have a 5-gallon bucket and I fill it with a substrate, it doesn't matter what substrate it is. If it's a 20% volumetric water content, that means there's 1 gallon or 20% of that space is occupied by water. If the substrate is bark, if the substrate is peat, if the substrate is concrete, if the substrate is popcorn, it doesn't matter what it is, it's the same amount of water. When we talk on a moisture content or a gravimetric basis, which is what we do more colloquially in the field, it's not really comparable because it's a percent of weight of the whole system, and that changes based on the substrate's weight. So another slide I got from my old advisor, Jim Owen, that really drives this point home. These are the same volume. You could tell by looking at it, they weigh completely differently. But if I were to put the same amount of water in both these cups, they would be at the same volumetric water content, so I could compare, but they'd be at a completely different gravimetric water content. And so using volumetric water content lets us compare, whereas gravimetric water content is kind of like comparing apples to oranges. Volumetric water content lets us compare apples to apples, or I'm in Louisiana, so maybe Satsuma to Satsuma. So we all know that there is a moisture profile or moisture gradient within a container. We're drier at the top, wetter at the bottom. This is from gravity. We'll talk about that. But just keep this in mind because this is really where our moisture content comes into play. Water potential, the next thing I'm going to talk about, the other force, is just the tendency of water to move one space to another, or how tightly water is bound up within the matrix. We can measure water potential as of a factor of 4 forces. The first is gravity. It's pretty simple. The higher up, water wants to move down with gravity. So the taller something is, the higher something is, the more likely it is to move down. Pretty straightforward. Osmotic potential has to do with salts and ions, and really it's the tendency of clean water to want to equilibrate and come with some more salty or more ionic water. And this is really a cool factor, but it doesn't really affect us in production at all. It's on a very micro scale, so we typically ignore osmotic potential. Tension or suction is our other primary factor of water potential, and this is just how tightly a pore holds onto water. And you can use this example from an old textbook of different straws, of a wide milkshake or Coke straw. You put it in water, the water is going to rise up just a little through capillary force, and that's tension. If you narrow the straw, it's a stronger tension. The water is going to move higher within. And so that's really the main force that is acting on a container. This is our porous substrates. And then finally, pressure is actually positive pressure. So if I were to go out to some water and physically push it, that is pressure. Again, that doesn't happen in practice, so we ignore that. So we really focus on gravity and tension. And these are our two primary forces to control water and air balance within a container system. Container height is really what we look at gravity, and that is what it is. It's pretty standard. Each container, if you have a taller container, you're going to have drier at the top because there's more gravity pulling that water down. A shorter squat container is going to be a little more hydrated at the top. And then matrix potential, your pore sizes. So between these two forces, every substrate container system has a unique moisture gradient. Okay, so that's really the science lesson. So what can we do with this information? Well, what we can and what we do as substrate scientists is we engineer substrates for more efficient resource use, water, fertilizer, time, effort, energy, what have you. And we also like to identify superior substrates and superior substrate properties for different scenarios, different production systems, and really like to understand how these substrates will work within these systems and kind of pair them up. And then moreover, what I'm going to talk to you today is about developing new substrate management techniques to improve production. We look at both economically and environmentally. And one of those techniques that myself and my colleagues around the country have been working on over the past few years has been called stratified substrates. And you may have heard of some of this, may not have. We've been kind of talking about it more and more recently. But stratified substrates is layering multiple different substrates within a single container. There's a lot of benefits to these, and I'm going to kind of go through it, but really it allows for targeted fertilizer placement within the container. There's potential for reduction of media costs. There's a lot of cool work coming out of Florida right now on reducing weed pressure with stratified substrates. And then what I'm really interested in and focus on is controlling the air and water balance within a container. We call it defying gravity. We're really redistributing water and air how we want it. But I'm going to take you through a little bit of the thought process of how we started with this idea and where we got to where we are today. I'm going to get my old advisor, Jim Owen, was thinking about this, and he had the first idea that I know of targeted fertilizer placement within the container. Him and a colleague, Anthony LaBute at NC State, did a project where they looked at putting fertilizer at just the top half of a container. The idea behind this is as you irrigate or as the fertilizer comes out, it moves down with gravity. So if you have a plant, a liner, a plug, what have you, you give a small root volume at the beginning, that fertilizer that's at the bottom of the container is going out the bottom before the plants ever have a chance to access it. So with putting the fertilizer in just the top half of a container, you get more parallel downward movement with roots. So they did this paper that Jim told me has not yet been published, but I hope they publish soon. It's really cool, where they looked at incorporated fertilizer versus fertilizer just in the top half versus another practice top dressing where we put the fertilizer on top, and they grew some hydrangea. Now you can see here the 5x, 0.5, 0.75, and 1x. 1x is your typical fertilizer. And when you do what the fertilizer bag says, you give it the typical amount, they all work. They grow a great plant. As you reduce the amount of fertilizer, you see first top dressing kind of falls off because it's the fertilizer is all on the very top and the roots have already grown past where the fertilizer and moved down quicker. But then when you go to even lower at half the rate, I think, and this is subjective, that the fertilizer in just the top half produced a really good plant equal to the full fertilizer and a little bit better, more full than the other two. A lot of this is subjective, but you can kind of make your own choice. But I thought it was a really cool idea. And it was at an IPPS meeting about 6-7 years ago. It was in Virginia when I was doing my PhD at Virginia Beach. We took these pictures at a nursery that has a 2-hopper system. And so it made it real plausible to do something like this because you could just put fertilizer in one hopper, the top half, and it would be not a lot of extra effort. And so once we realized that there was a plausible way to put targeted fertilizer at just the top half, we started thinking of what else we could do. And then we always think about this container moisture profile. And like I mentioned earlier, there's two forces that determine the moisture profile. And this moisture profile is really dry on the top, where we have to irrigate constantly to keep that top layer moist. But that means it's really wet on the bottom, and all that water builds up at the bottom. And so you don't have a uniformity in there. Container height is what container height is. Yeah, we could use a bigger pot or a taller pot, but that really doesn't change too much on a grand scale. So matrix potential. We can fill a pot with a really fine substrate that's going to hold a lot more water, and it's going to do better for that top half because it's going to hold more water. But then you're going to really hold too much in the bottom half. You don't have that drainage capability. Conversely, you could use a really coarse mix and hold optimal water in the bottom half, but then the top is going to dry out really quick. It's going to become hydrophobic. It's going to be a whole world of problems, which is why we use the substrates we use, because they're really well optimized for a container system. But do we have to keep doing everything the way we've done it for 50, 60 years, filling the whole container with the same thing? So let's kind of go through the science on this. So if this is a pot and it's the container height, typically you'll have a moisture gradient, something like this. It's dry at the top, wet at the bottom. Again, every container system is pretty unique, has its own, call it like a fingerprint. Now, if I put really fine material on the top that wants to hold water where gravity says not to hold water, and I put really coarse material on the bottom that wants to drain where gravity says to hold water, we get more of a uniform moisture curve. In theory, this is all in theory, and we're defying gravity. We're keeping water where it doesn't want to go. So kind of look, this is kind of what the difference is. So more water on the top where the active growing zone is early, less water on the bottom, so we're not becoming any anoxic conditions. So we ran some computer simulations. And I'm sorry, I got the dots switched up on these. But on the left, this is all a computer model situation where the solid line is what it says, a conventional container filled all the way uniform with a bark or a peat or what have you is. You, again, dry at the top, fully saturate at the bottom. And then this dotted line is what it says a stratified system would be. So you see that it says there's a 40%, you don't have the numbers, but in the conventional, there'd be a 40% gradient from the top to the bottom in volumetric water content, which is pretty extreme, but it is what we see. And in stratified, we narrow that to a 20% gradient. Then we looked at in practice using different sensors. You can see on the right, the dots and the lines are up. Now the solid line is a stratified, but it's pretty close to what the model's saying. You are really reducing that gradient, making it more uniform. So the science behind it of just pure water on a physics level actually works. So that was really cool. So now what we got to do is we got to test it. So the very first research we did, myself and colleagues, Jim Owen, James Altman, wrote a Horticulture Research Institute grant to look at this, both in Louisiana, Virginia, and Ohio. So I'm going to talk about what I did in Louisiana. We made some stratified substrate treatments where I just used a traditional bark as a control. And then on the other three treatments, we had really coarse bark on the bottom, and we put on the top either a fine bark, a conventional bark, or a bark with peat. So higher hydraulic conductivity, more water potential, holding water up there. We grew drift roses under normal and deficit irrigation. And in the control, we mixed the recommended amount of fertilizer throughout the whole container. In the three stratified, we mixed fertilizer only in the top strata, and we reduced it by 20% total. So there was 20% less fertilizer, but it was all placed in the top. And this is just so you can kind of see the difference in the barks that we used. There was a pretty stark difference. And so we had physical properties, and don't waste your time reading this. What I really want to highlight is the total porosity at the bottom. We engineered these so if you took into account the porosity at the top and the bottom of the container, it remained the same in every system. We just changed the air and water balance within the container. There was the same amount of air, same amount of water. It was redistributed. And this is our growth. Growth index, a good measure of how much the plants grew over a short period of time. The top is we had our control normal irrigation, the bottom reduced. I kind of ignore the reduced because this is southern Louisiana and we have over 100 inches of rain that year. So can we really count that? But looking at a normal growth, this blue bars are the traditionally grown plants. And you can see over time, all of the stratified treatments slowly take up and outperform and outgrow these. And so we were seeing improved, quicker growth in the stratified, which was really cool. Until the final, when we harvested them, there you see every stratified treatment basically outperformed the unstratified treatment. Really neat. Here's midway through, just a picture we took. You can see they're already outperforming this control, and there's less fertilizer. So we grew these better plants with less fertilizer. So I thought that was really, really neat. So from that project, we kind of find that we could grow quick substrate or quick plant with stratified substrates using less fertilizer. Again, the deficit water, I didn't prove any deleterious. There's no problem with it, but was it really deficit when you had 100 inches of rain that year? And so we took this project on an extra year, just so you know, and we found that there was not much of a difference once the whole roots were explored. So it really gave us a lot of impact in that first growing season when these roots were exploring the container. And once the container became a root system already, it didn't have as much impact, but it never hindered it. So it was really helpful at the beginning. Just to show you real quickly, what James Altman and Jim Owen did at the USDA on that same grant is they're growing large container maples. And so this is still ongoing because it's a much longer time, but again, with the reduced fertilizer, reduced water, and you can see they're pretty similar except for the roots. So on this one, the far right is the control. And you can see how much the increased rooting is on these other ones, especially in that one with the fine bark over the coarse bark. It's really neat. So there's a lot of opportunity there. Next thing we did, I have a graduate student who actually just finished his master's, starting his PhD, Christopher, and his whole work was on looking at stratified substrates and pairing them with more optimal or targeted irrigation schedules to kind of flesh out these benefits. So real quick, a couple of his projects, we did the same thing. We looked at a control, just a regular bark system, and then 3 stratified. We used the coarse over either a bark peat or a fine bark. And this time, instead of a conventional bark on the top, we found that that one didn't work too well. The last, we used a bark core, which is something I'm just a big fan of in general. And then now we looked at it as a single application versus a cyclic application. And the cyclic, we basically irrigated it 3 times with the total volume being the same as the single application. We applied it all in the morning. So it's kind of spreading that out throughout the day. We also looked at the deficit of both of these, where we reduced the irrigation total by 25%, I believe. And there's a lot of data. I'm just going to show you a couple highlights, but this is the growth index again. Just to walk you through it, the black line is the control. On the top, you have our single application, and the bottom is cyclic irrigation. On the left, it's just traditional full water. On the right, it is deficit irrigation. So what you can first see is that in all but one scenario, every stratified treatment outgrew the control. Again, the control had less fertilizer as well, but it was mixed throughout. There was some interesting on the single application deficit, they all grew the same. I think that has a lot to do with refilling the pot, but we're going to kind of investigate that further. Elsewise, what I'd like to point out is in every situation, the stratified with the bark and the core outperformed every other plant, which was really neat. And then if you look down the bottom right, the cyclic deficit, this is just a little bit of water 3 times a day. Once it started getting really hot and we had a little bit of a dry period in Louisiana, you can see the plants get smaller, which is actually showing that they're dying. Those plants can't handle that when we went really low water 3 times a day. And so the stratified system just kept going up, kept growing, which was really neat. So even in a drought or problematic situation, these stratified substrates kind of overcame that drought, or the plants did, where the traditional plants couldn't. So super exciting stuff for me. His next project, we wanted to kind of hone it down and look at the water flux within the system. It's going to get really technical for just a second. But we just looked at regular bark, conventional, and then a 1 stratified system, which is the general with a fine bark over coarse bark. And we took the deficit irrigation, so we just had the same single application and then cyclic of 3 times a day, same total amount of water. This time we fit all the containers, a lot of the containers with tensiometers, which measure water potential in each strata, the top and the bottom. And we also use volumetric water sensors to kind of get an overall idea of what's going on within the container, the moisture. And this is what we get. So this is a fallow pot. There's no plant in this. Let me walk you through it. This is the tension. So the lower the tension, the drier it is. This is water potential. The blue lines represent the top of the container. The red lines represent the bottom of the container. Moreover, the top two graphs are non-stratified with single and cyclic, and the bottom two graphs are stratified. So instantly what you see is the water losses from the top as it drains down to the bottom or as it evaporates out the top. So there's a lot of water fluctuation in the top, little fluctuation in the bottom. There's a lot less fluctuation in the stratified on these two. They kind of mimic each other. And that goes back to that initial idea of that they're more water uniformity, water balanced. So this was really exciting, and this was without plants. So then we planted some dianthus. We grew them out for a couple months till they were fully rooted. And this is what we get. Again, same thing, lower numbers mean dry, or lower lines mean drier. The blue is the top strata, the red is the bottom. The non-stratified are the two graphs on the top, the stratified are the two graphs on the bottom. See, very similar. The stratified on the bottom really kept that uniformity of those plants, and there wasn't that really heavy drying out every day. What was really excited me is the top right graph, where the cyclic in the non-stratified, you start seeing a lot of drying out in the bottom half. And that's because with the cyclic, you're only feeding that top half of that container really. And so the bottom half of the roots had to start doing work and pulling up water. When typically we're seeing from this that it's our upper roots in the upper half of the container that are really actively pulling most of the water, which was just awesome. This is our volumetric water content. It's not much, nothing to tell you, but what it does is it checks to make sure that all the sensors are actually working. They spike at the same time, they go up at the same time. So we could tell that this was actually what we were seeing was real. So that was cool. And this is the third part of what he did. And now we wanted to look at a single irrigation event and how these stratified substrates will hold water. So again, there's a lot going on here, but we did our stratified, non-stratified substrate treatment. We measured these fallow without roots, and then fully planted, we let them root out and grow. We did it on a single application and a cyclic application, and then we tested at different moisture contents, where it started really wet, moisture content where a normal you might start irrigating, and then a really dry, what would happen? And so he built this system. It was really cool. What you see here is these are all hanging lysimeters. And so the pot is free hanging on a load cell that measures the weight of the pot or the volume of the pot if you use water, the density. So we can tell how much water goes into this container over time. And then there's a load cell on the bottom that's measuring the water that drains out. So we can tell the exact moment the water drains and how much is coming out. We're still analyzing this data, or excuse me, this is what it looks like in practice. It was really exciting. It worked really well. And so we're still analyzing it, but this is kind of just one scenario I wanted to show you. This was an incredibly dry, just a single application, so not cyclic. The solid line on the bottom are the retention, where the drainage. Green is stratified, black is non-stratified. The dashed lines in the middle, that is the hanging lysimeter. That is the total water holding in the container. And then the double dashed lines at the top are just the maximum water holding that system could hold. So we instantly see that the stratified holds a little more total water, but you can see the difference in these two lines between the black and the green is how much more water the stratified is holding in a drier situation. So when it's dry and that water comes in, stratified can pull up more before the preferential flow or the channeling takes over and that water just rapidly drains out. Again, we're still analyzing this. We hope to publish this soon, but this was kind of give us insight on a single, what's happening during a single irrigation. And this is kind of all the clutter taken away. It's just the water retention. This was out without roots just because it was clean. We're holding, of the 300 mils of water or so that go in here, we're holding an extra 50 roughly in the stratified system that's not leaching out or draining. So pretty cool. I know I'm going fast. There's a lot. I'm just moving through, but it seemed in my mind that there was good benefit to stratified substrates. So we wanted to find a easy, pragmatic way that a grower could trial this or employ this pretty quickly. So Chris, and this is my research associate, Ashley, did this project last year where we grew crepe myrtles in single screen substrates. And what I mean by that is we took a screen, either a 3/8 inch screen or a 1/4 inch screen or a 4 millimeter for really fine screen, and we screen bark, just regular bark. You see Chris doing it there. And we built the system around a single screen. So the fine particles from a 9 or a 3/8 inch were stacked on top of the coarse particles from a 3/8 inch. So if you had one bark pile and you could separate it one time and then use it, this is what you would do. This graph down here, we can kind of see that the larger screen gave us more of a 50-50 total mix of the media, and the smaller the screen, the less the fines we got, and so the more coarse. So you kind of use that to gauge what a grower might want to use or what you might want to ask for based on having extra material or losing some or what have you. Grew crepe myrtles because we had crepe myrtles and they grow pretty quickly in anything. But you can kind of see there, this is growth index again. There's not a lot of change or differentiation between these growth. They all grew pretty well in growth index. You can see the picture here, the 4 millimeter, which is the finest top layer and the most uniform bottom layer, grew a little taller. They had greater height, but in the growth index, they were more tight. So it kind of washed. What was really neat was the rooting we noticed was incredibly different. So what we did is we took half of our replicates and we sawed them right in half, right on the stratified line. And we took the dry weights, which everyone hated doing, of the roots on both the tops and the bottom half separately. And I also took the media in these, and I don't have that here, but it was really cool to see how the bottom layer, the physical properties changed. The top layer didn't change too much over time, but again, something else. So what this graph is the red is the root dry mass of the roots in the upper strata, and the blue is the dry mass of the roots in the lower strata. So if you stack these, they're the total root mass. So instantly we can see that the 4 millimeter screen and the 9.5 millimeter screen grew more roots than anything else. And the 6.3 or the 1/4 inch, which is what we've been using as our control stratified treatment, really mimicked the control in root growth. So that was kind of interesting to see. We all see that there's higher root growth in the upper half in every situation, but it was really extended or expanded in the stratified system. So we had a lot of root growth in the upper half. But the whole point is the roots were growing differently and more improved rooting. We see this in a lot of different areas. We saw it in the red maples that Dr. Zaltman and Owen did, and we're seeing it here, just a lot improved rooting, which I thought was just really neat. So from that, we kind of found that we can easily make a stratified system out of a single screen. You don't have to over-engineer it, and root architecture is affected, which we really want to kind of explore that further. And while you don't have to over-engineer it, fine-tuning of those layers will probably give you more influence on root and shoot growth. So it is possible to do it with a quick single screen, but I think more detailing might help out, might benefit. So then we did some on-farm trials. Myself, I mentioned Jim and James and Chris Marble at University of Florida wrote a grant for the Oregon Association of Nurseries a few years ago to trial this, because all of our research had been done in the East with loblolly pine bark, and so we just kind of thought, why not see how it works in a Doug fir bark, a different bark system. And we got 2 of the larger nurseries out there to kind of let us come out, set up some stuff, take up some space, and then they grew these plants for us, which was really cool. You can kind of see here, we see a lot at the bottom, these hydrangeas, still a lot of improved rooting in the stratified system. And we did a lot. We did a fertilizer placement, we did a stratified for growth, and we did a weed study that I'm not going to talk about. I'm just going to talk about the one that stratified for growth. And so these are PJM azaleas grown at 2 different locations. You can see in the red box is the control, and then the other boxes are the stratified treatments. And so in some times we grew better plants, and sometimes we didn't. It was never a worse plant, but again, it's really detailed on what you get, and it varies crop and crop system specific. If you're over watering or watering a lot, it's not going to make much of a difference. If you're going to low water, we see a lot of differences. Here's some more. Again, they just pruned these hydrangeas right before we got to take photos. So we don't have the overall growth of the hydrangeas in photos, but you can see the root change and just the massive increase in rooting in the stratified substrates. And then some thuyas that had a little bit of difference, I think I see. But again, this is more subjective, kind of like you make your own mind up. And then last but not least, this is kind of why I love extension. I love meetings like this. I love talking with growers, because I was at a Louisiana Nursery and Landscape Association meeting, and I was telling some of the growers there about stratified work and how excited I was and how I could save water or fertilizer, blah, blah, blah. And I've been fixated for 2 years on this. And one of the growers just said, why wouldn't you ever try and save soil costs by using this layering cheap bark or low cost bark below a really high designer media that costs us a lot? We could cut our soil costs. And I just stared blank face, and I was like, yeah, in 2 years, I'd never considered that, but that's a great idea. So we did that. We went to his farm, and he set these up, and he did it all himself, had his guys just hand mix some bark in the bottom of their floriculture crops. And this is what he sent me the picture. And if you look, right down the middle is the line. Everything on the left is stratified, everything on the right is not. And so I was instantly scared, because you can see they're all flowering on the non-stratified, the traditional side, and none of it's flowering, or not very low flowering on the stratified side. Well, it turns out and as we all know, they lower the water. They put water stress on them to induce flowering. We had built a system in the stratified system that was so powerful, they could not water stress these plants. And so they didn't go into water stress. When he turned the irrigation down to stress the plants to get them to flower, the stratified just kept growing. They didn't experience that stress, which was really cool. Unfortunately, it didn't work, but they ended up all catching up. He sold every plant. And so they had some other observations. They said it was, there's no data on this, but they thought it produced a more compact plant in the stratified, which might help with shipping. They could delay the flowering easier. They could grow lower water. And then they also said the same thing. They saw improved rooting. This is their photos in the stratified system. One other really cool thing we've seen, and they saw as well, is in the stratified system, the earliest emerging roots are pretty much always horizontal and lateral, whereas other traditional are going straight down. And is this good or bad? I don't know yet. We're really gonna explore this further, but we've seen this in most cases. The initial rooting in the stratified system comes out lateral, and so that was really exciting. But yeah, and you can see just in these pictures alone, the very top on that non-stratified looks dry, and the very top on the stratified doesn't. So these stratified systems can actually prevent water issues and overcome some water stress. So overall, I think I'm sticking to my 45 minute time. I think we could say that there are crop growth benefits with stratified substrates, but those are very crop and situation specific. From what we've seen, sometimes we grow crops that are the exact same, sometimes more improved. We've never seen in any of our research we've done collectively 10 or 15 different projects. I've never seen any that did worse than the stratified. I do believe reduction of fertilizer is in play with targeted fertilizer application. I think that is pretty clear. We've seen from our experiments. I'm very fan of improved water management if you employ this properly, but again, you're going to see more benefits in low water systems. If you water heavily, it's not going to have as much benefit that we've seen on water retention, because it's really about maximizing the efficiency of that water. And so it really, you start to see the benefits when it's in a drier scenario. Potential soil reduction costs. We have a project that we just started up. We're going to really dial into looking at designer substrates and high cost substrates over lower substrates to see if that actually work. And I really think that specific engineering of substrate layers can really target specific solutions. And then I don't have it here, but I also want to say University of Florida, our colleagues Chris Marble and his grad student Yuri were doing some really cool stuff on what's kind of reverse stratification, but they might not call it reverse. Maybe they consider what I'm doing as reverse, where they're putting coarse material on the bottom, and they just published a paper by using coarse, or they're putting coarse material on the top instead of the bottom. And it's drying out the top to prevent weed seed germination. They just published a paper a couple of weeks ago that was really awesome, where they had a massive reduction in weed germination. I think it was a 80%, don't quote me on that, but something crazy, by doing stratified substrates, just the other way around. So I think this all kind of lets us know that what we've been doing for so long works, and we know it does, but there's so much more. The solution could be in the pot, as Jim always says. There's so much more opportunity out there by rethinking how we do things, and just using a little bit of substrate science can kind of get us there. That's pretty much it. I do want to thank, we had so many groups and associations and nurseries and suppliers that really helped with this research and sponsored this research. I'd like to thank them all, especially the Louisiana Nursery and Landscape Association. But everyone that's helped and supported this, we really do appreciate it. And I can take any questions.
All right. Wow, Jeb, that was amazing. I'd heard about some of that, but I hadn't really seen the results of any of the research. And so that really feels like a huge move forward in substrates. So I am really grateful for learning about it from you. And I appreciated that you all can sort of share the projects that you're doing together and to move it forward. And that's what we're about in IPPS, is speaking and sharing. And so this is a perfect topic for this meeting. We do have some time for questions, and we're grateful to everyone who is here, whether you're from the Southern region or Eastern region, or you're not a member. We hope you'll consider it. We do have the Southern region meeting is coming up in October 16th through 20th in Athens, Georgia this year. And we were just chatting over here on the side, like maybe we'll, as we move forward, maybe we can put together a substrates panel or something, because there is so much that has changed over time. So we have 15 minutes or so for questions. If you would like to unmute yourself and ask your question, I'll highlight you for the recording. And then if you all just want to put your question in the chat, I'll read it to Jeb. I think, Laura, I saw you unmute yourself. Would you like to ask a question?
No, I was just excited. I thought that was a great presentation.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Keith asks, how are growers reacting to making changes to their potting lines? And I actually had that question too. Like, is it going to be, how much work is it going to take to shift production systems around? You know, we had that, you mentioned that one that had 2 hoppers. They're set up for it, but would other growers need to set up something similar?
Yeah, and that's one of the areas that we want to expend a little research effort, because we don't know. I have, like I said, on the small scale trials, I've got growers that are doing it by hand. And when we set up our trials, we're doing it by hand. And it is definitely an added cost and time. There is the option of the dual hopper system, but I understand that's really expensive. So what we want to kind of do is find out the benefits of stratified, and if the cost of that outweighs the extra time or effort to do some stratification. Smaller operations that are filling by hand, it shouldn't take much extra time. It will still take extra time, but I know a lot of operations that are doing it here that I've talked to, or trying it, or just doing it by hand. They say it's not too much extra effort, but it probably would be on a massive scale. So that's somewhere we want to, I think we're pretty certain that there's benefits from the science of the actual production, but we got to see if they're strong enough. Some growers we worked with have told us absolutely not. It's just, there's not enough benefit to make this change, but it really depends on your own operation and how easily you can incorporate it. And if anyone's interested, I'd be more than happy, and I know my colleagues that are working on this, more than happy to help set up a trial on farm on a small scale, see if it's worth it, see if it helps in your situation.
Did you, and that has a second question. A follow-up question to this was about finances. So if you looked into what the cost savings may be, and I think that's probably a component, but it also maybe makes a difference on the size of the container. So when, like, the bigger you get, that's a different scenario.
Absolutely. And like, this is one of our next focal areas. We want to really look at the investment cost and do some economic analysis on the savings in fertilizer and water. And it also goes back to your production system. If you're a low grower, or if you're in a place that water is more scarce and you got to pay for your water or it's expensive, I think there's a lot of benefit. In Louisiana, where we don't pay for water, it's there and we get a lot. It might not be. It's more looking at the fertilizer. And maybe I think what Dr. Marble and his team are doing, and Dr. Altland and weed science, and using these stratified reverse systems to help improve or save on herbicide or pre-emergent costs is also huge too. And that could be a major area where you can see some pretty quick financial.
Well, and fertilizer has really gone up. So any place we can save is gonna
urea was touching $1,000 just the other day. So.
Okay, the next question is, how did you choose your core?
How did I choose my core?
Yeah, were there multiple suppliers, or?
I just been using pith. Excuse me.
Oh, I didn't say, did I fall out? Sorry.
I got it on just.
Maybe one of us. So the question was, how did you choose your core?
We got it from what our distributor sells core.
Okay,
I
so
believe
nothing.
the one we used was a fiber dust, and I just bought it through our distributor, just regular core blocks.
Okay. Okay, next question. Have you done any trials with landscape plugs or seed production?
We have not done any with seed production, but actually landscape plugs, yeah, a lot of some of those trials we use the big landscape liners in. I think especially the crepe myrtles. It's not the question that was asked, but another area that we're really excited about, and I've actually got some projects going on, is we understand that the end goal of a lot of these nursery plants are going in the landscape, and with the improved rooting, we have some growing, and we're going to look at transplant success, and if it helps it out and increases transplant success with this improved rooting through stratified systems. So
nice. Keith is excited that you'll do house calls, and he wants you to come to Canada. One of us broke up. Is it you? No. Okay. All right.
I love it. Yeah.
One last question that we have so far, and we still have time for questions if anybody wants to pipe up and speak it or put it in the chat. And it was just a clarification question about whether there was in your substrate, was it just bark core, and bark peat, or were there other mixes that you tried with the stratification so far?
I'm sorry, Cheryl. I don't know if I'm lagging or if it's you, but I can't hear anything you're saying.
Darn it. How about now?
It's just very in and out. In case
maybe you can you check the chat? It's
in
about
case
what
it's not on my end. I'm looking at the chat. So I see the question, is there only bark core, or bark peat? We've used different grades of bark, and then I've used peat and core as fibers to increase the water holding of the upper stratas so far. Of course, we lime all the substrate at both sides, and then in most of the are just on the top, incorporating the top, and that's different in whichever projects we've done. But we have not looked at other substrate or other substrate amendments yet. It is on the horizon.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Kind of.
Laura, is it me? Can anybody else hear? Is it me?
I can hear you just fine.
Okay.
Yeah,
Maybe
I think it might be Jeb's connection.
Laura, am I lagging?
Yeah, well, right now you're frozen.
It's all those trees that are down at the station.
Jeb, where'd you go?
Yesterday I got kicked out of a Zoom meeting, so I thought maybe it was me. Okay, so if we may have lost Jeb, we do have Brandon has a really good question there at the end about other non-conventional substrate components. And I certainly think there probably are opportunities, and it sounds like they're still just getting started with this line of research. So they should have lots more opportunity to ask, research questions and investigate this in the future would be my guess. So we lost him. He may rejoin, but in the meantime, I just want to take a minute to thank all of you for attending an IPPS Southern Region event. We're super happy to be able to sponsor these. And if you have ideas for talks or subjects that you would like to learn more about, we're more than happy to find the right speaker for that and put something together. So please reach out, let us know. And we'll see what we can do in the future. We don't have a schedule for the next one, but we will. So we'll work on that. So let us know what you're interested in. And in the meantime, we'll look forward to Athens and seeing everybody's faces all together.